Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar is titled Differentiated Instruction in an Adult Education Classroom, specifically for ESOL. This webinar, like all IP Day webinars, is sponsored by the Florida Department of Education. All content can be reproduced, retransmitted, and redistributed for educational purposes. Hi, I'm June Rawl, IP Day Director. With me today is Ronald Cruz. You know, we've heard a lot about differentiated instruction and even attended some workshops on the subject. For those of you who attended the ELPS workshops last spring, you'll remember some of these strategies that we're going to discuss today. This webinar today is intended to be a follow-up to those discussions, but no matter how much we discuss it, we are still looking for practical ways to implement differentiated instruction into our classroom. Oh, and how about those multi-level classrooms? Quite a challenge, right? Well, we hope that by the end of today and by the end of this webinar, you'll see that successful multi-level classrooms are a result of differentiated instruction. Ron's going to talk about some multi-level activities in his presentation today too. So this will provide you with some really great, easy tools that you can access immediately, like those graphic organizers. Today we're going to focus on maximize learning while at the same time attending to our students' diverse needs. We'll also discuss how we can alter our instructional strategies to meet the needs of all students and show how differentiated instruction can really be a benefit to all of us. But before we get started, please note that your attendee microphones are muted. If you have a question, and I really hope you do, please type it in the Q&A section on your screen. We will monitor the questions throughout the webinar to make sure that we respond to your questions and comments. If you have any technical questions or concerns, please type them in as well. As in the past, today's webinar is being recorded. Look for it in the archives on the IP Day website. The recorded webinars will be available within 48 hours. As you access materials from the webinar section of the IP Day website, be sure to visit other sections of the IP Day website as we continue to upload new resources for GED Prep, ABE, and the ESL classroom. There are a lot of great resources on the IP Day website that you can use to implement differentiated instruction. If you need assistance in getting your hands on them, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to serve you. Okay, Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you and let's get started with today's webinar.
Thank you very much, June. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesdays. Our topic for today is differentiating instruction in adult ESOL classrooms. My name is Ronald Cruz. I am the coordinator of the Caribe Refugee Program. I'm the coordinator of the Caribe Refugee Program here in Hillsborough County. I'm also a statewide trainer for adult basic education, GED, and ESL through the Florida IP Day organization. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Just like what June said, your microphones are going to be in mute. The only way for you to be able to ask questions, provide comments, is through your Q&A tab. By clicking on the Q&A tab, a window will open which will allow you to type in your question, and we will respond to your questions throughout the webinar. If at some reason I'm not able to respond to your question by the end of this webinar, we will take all of these questions that are unanswered and then email them to you directly. So let's talk about today's agenda. Our agenda for today will be focusing on differentiated instruction. So we'll first talk about the meaning of differentiated instruction. Why is it important for the ESL classroom? And then we're going to talk about certain practical strategies, techniques, and modifications that you can do in your daily instruction to implement differentiation. We're also going to look at the recommendations from the English Language Proficiency Standards on differentiation. We're also going to talk about some strategies, tips, tricks, graphic organizers, techniques that I've seen implemented throughout the field of ESL and also in my own personal instruction in ESL. And then we're going to talk about some materials and activities that you can find throughout the IPDAY website that will help you in implementing differentiated instruction. And then we're going to talk about other resources that are available to you for your ESL classroom. We'll take some questions before the end of the webinar to take in some of those final questions, and we'll do an online poll for your evaluation. So what is differentiation? We hear this a lot. It's being tossed around by a lot of teachers. It's a big buzzword for K-12, but it is also very important and it has some very practical applications to adult education. By definition, differentiation is very simple. It's just whatever you do or whatever your efforts or whatever efforts you do in your classroom to accommodate for the variance of learners among your students. Our ultimate goal is to vary the teaching in order to create the best possible learning experience for your students. However, you may want to do that. Maybe use visual aids, maybe use graphic organizers. How do you promote students that promote writing with your students? Do you start with a sentence frame? How do you promote vocabulary? How about those struggling readers? How about those students that cannot write or struggling writers? How do you incorporate content into the material? As we move on day to day, we are faced with a huge amount of tasks to teach so much content, and at the bottom line is the students have to learn, but they all don't learn the same way. So that's why we have to differentiate instruction in order to reach various learners. Just to give you a little bit of an overview, there's different ways the teacher can differentiate their instruction. You can differentiate based on the content, so meaning you can differentiate if let's say you're teaching a reading article on a particular topic, you can vary the content based on the student's interests, their personality, or their learning style. You can also differentiate by context. The context that you teach is really on what area of relevance of topic your topic that you're teaching will apply for your students. You can also differentiate the product, whatever they produce in the end. It doesn't have to always be a piece of writing or a completed worksheet. It could also be, let's say, an acted out or a skit or a model or a diagram or a mathematics chart, just differentiating the instruction to various learning styles. There's different ways your students can show their proficiency in various areas and show mastery or demonstrate mastery of learning different things in your class. And also you can differentiate the learning environment. You can put them in a small group, in a large group. You can also put your students in a quiet place. You can add background music to allow your auditory learners to engage more in the topic, and so on and so forth. Why is it important to differentiate instruction in the ESL classroom? So at this point, I'm going to take in some comments from all of you who are participating in this webinar. Please use the Q&A tab in your on your toolbar. Just click on it, and I'd like to hear your comments. Is it important to really differentiate in instruction? Are we encountering any problems as we incorporate these techniques into your practice? What are the types of things that you have done in your class that has proven to be successful? Is it making a difference? Are your plans to differentiate instruction paying off? Are you observing that? So let's take in some of the comments from the field. And Mr. Black said he uses he differentiate his instruction to meet the learning needs of his students. Very good. Thank you very much. It's all about the students, really, what we're trying to do here. They're the bottom line. And whatever you do to make it work for them, you as a teacher knows your student best. You know which students are more comfortable sitting in the front of the room rather than the ones that are sitting in the back of the room. Also in grouping, you know which students you cannot mix up together just because they won't be able to work or they won't be able to be productive in the class. So you might have to differentiate that way. So there's many, many ways that we can do that. And let me take in some more answers here. Miss Romero says it is important because we have different cultural backgrounds and ages in the same classroom, and that is correct. For adult education, we start enrolling students at the age of 18 and above. So we can have an 18-year-old student in the class, and we can have a 60 to 65-year-old student sitting in the same class. So do they both learn the same way? How do you make sure that every student is making the best of their time while sitting in your class? According to Mr. Doherty, his students have a very diverse educational background, school structure and experience, and that's really true, especially in the ESL. Not every student knows how to navigate the educational system of adult education in America. And a lot of them, they need a little bit of help and a little bit of support. A lot of them are maybe coming to you with already a professional knowledge or technical skills. Some of them are already college graduates, or they have degrees, or are practicing professionals in their native country, and they're coming here just to learn English from you. So really and truly, we want to be able to become more sensitive, which, just like what Miss Pamela Joe said, is becoming a little bit more sensitive to varying cultures of your students. The more you reach out to them, the more your students are going to become engaged. So here are some of the things that I think is the reason why we have to differentiate classroom in the ESL. And some of these have already been mentioned by you through the Q&A. Our students have varying levels of English proficiency. They have varying cultural, educational, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Some of our students really have a need for resources. They may not have a library card as compared to another student that lives very far from a public library. So how do you address that need for resources? So do you provide that student everything in your disposal to make the best of their time in the classroom? There are varying learning styles, just like we said, but more importantly, adult students have varying study habits. A lot of our students are working or are holding multiple jobs and are coming to your classroom to learn. So are you giving them the opportunity to be able to learn while they're on the job, to practice their English and incorporate those English strategies and learning techniques into their job, which would be most ideal? Students have varying levels of access to technology and other resources, just like we said, access to public library. But a lot of our students already have access to mobile technology. A lot of them already have smartphones and are able to use that in learning English. Also, students have varying levels of commitment and educational goals. Just like we said, a 65-year-old student sitting in your class may not have the same academic goals as a student that is 18-year-old working towards the GED. Or it could be different from another person, a 35-year-old trying to recertify in the United States and needs the English language proficiency in order to be able to take that certification test. So you really, as an ESL teacher, hold the key to achieving those goals. Just like any other educational practice, there's always two sides to that. So we don't want to oversell differentiated instruction. However, we wanted to point out some of the strong benefits of differentiated instruction. So what you're looking in your screen is the benefits or the pluses and the deltas, or things that you may tweak or may have to consider as you apply differentiated instruction. So let's go first with all of the positive benefits of differentiated instruction. One of the things is really, really helpful to our students that are high achieving. By differentiating your instruction, you're able to continue their engagement in class. It also increases student responsibility towards the learning. If they have more responsibility towards their learning, there's more engagement in the classroom, and you will notice that as a teacher. Also, I do not want to fail to mention that students with disabilities are the greatest benefactors of differentiating instruction. So for these students, we really have to provide some accommodations, modifications into our instruction so that they can reach and be able to master content. Providing those accommodations are key for our students to become more successful. Let's take a look at some of the disadvantages or the deltas of differentiated instruction. Just like anything that's good in the classroom, it comes with good preparation. So a caveat that I would like to tell you is that it takes a little bit more effort in planning, not so much as time, because what we want is for the students to learn better. So we have to plan for those and get to learn, get to know our students a little bit better. What do they like? What do they like to read? What do they want to write about? Those types of things takes a little bit more effort on the part of the teacher. But with efficient planning techniques, you should be able to apply differentiated instruction in your classroom in the most efficient fashion. And also, just like any other instructional strategy or technique that we're trying to pursue, some of the techniques might require special resources for implementation, resources that you or your school may not have. Your resourcefulness would really play a good role into the success of differentiating your instruction. Please keep in mind that resources are now readily available to you throughout the World Wide Web. So go and Google what have other teachers have done in order to address those various planning needs and resources needs into differentiated instruction, and you'll find yourself enriching your toolbox for teaching. So let's talk about differentiating content. One of the things that teachers can do in order to differentiate content is to allow for the variance in ability levels in your students. So you may have a foundation or ESL level 1 sitting in your class together with a high intermediate or level 4 student in your class. Those students, however they have varying ability levels, they do have the same academic goal. So one of the things that you can do in order to differentiate instruction is to differentiate content. Let's just say you wanted to talk about one thing or one theme or one topic, like places in the community or contributing to a community. Well, I found one article in Newsela, and I don't know about you, but Newsela is such a really cool website because it provides us with a plethora of reading, social studies, science, and even mathematics articles, and they are written in the levels of students that students would understand. So just like what you're looking at in your screen right now, you have two examples of Newsela. I'm showing you to your left of your screen, you will see a level 1 Newsela versus a level 2 Newsela article on the same topic. So as you can see, the titles may be different. The word counts are different, but they're both talking about the same topic, which is describing how this person is putting together a fruit farm in the middle of the city. You will notice also in some of the Newsela articles that the font size differ from level to level. So the font size decreases as you go to a higher level. The word count also increases. But the bottom line is the students are reading the same material and they're able to participate in the classroom discussion, writing prompt activity, or any classroom activity focusing on this same topic. So what I really do suggest is for you to check out Newsela and look at some articles that relate to some of the topics that you will be covering in the various themes of ESOL, may it be family, may it be communication, employment, health, or transportation. All of these things, they have several articles that your students can learn from. Another way to differentiate your instruction is to differentiate the product. So what I'm showing you right now is using the same reading article, Fruit Farm in the City, and written in various levels. You can have your students read the same level of material, but then differentiate the product. So here in this case, maybe in my classroom activity for my lower level students, I'm going to be using picture cards so that they can understand and make the connection between vocabulary words and pictures. And then also, I can do a question and answer or an oral question and answer with my students. But since they are low level, I may not expect my students to be able to completely state the answer. They can simply give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a simple yes or no if we've already taught that topic. Also, asking simple WH questions is going to be really helpful. Like, for example, where? Where is the setting of the story or the article that we're reading? So can they identify whether it's a city or a countryside? And I can show pictures of a city and pictures of a countryside and draw the qualities of a city and the qualities of the countryside and compare them to how they're being described in the article. You can also talk about who. Okay, is it the female is the main character of the story or the article? Or is it the male who is she's showing to? I can also write down all of the vocabulary words for my lower level students so I can already prepare them for everything that they will encounter while reading. So once we read, once we start reading the article, it will be very smooth to them. Sometimes I will do dictation with my students. Dictation is another strategy that is recommended by the English Language Proficiency Standards, which is one of the most popular ways to improve students' listening skills and also writing skills and also their familiarity with vocabulary. Sentence frames are very useful for my lower level students because they do not have enough grammar knowledge in order to construct basic sentences to answer questions. So sometimes in order for them to answer a question in either writing or a spoken form, I would provide them with a sentence frame. All they have to do is complete the sentence frame with key details from what they've read. For the middle level students, I may have to increase the level of difficulty or cognitive demand, such as I'm probably, instead of using pictures, I may now just use note cards. And then as we go higher in the levels, instead of just asking what and who and where, I can now start asking why, because these students now have some level of English in order for them to be able to respond orally. I may also have written vocabulary words for these level of students and also practice dictation with them. And lastly, I may want to differentiate my instruction for those visual learners that love graphic organizers, that at the end of the activity, I would like for them to complete a Frayer model. And we're going to talk about what a Frayer model is. For those of you who do not know what a Frayer model is, I'm going to show you what it is. I'm going to give you an example and also show you where you can find out more about Frayer model if you want to apply that in your classroom. And lastly, for my higher level students, I would probably ask them to create a glossary of terms because they already have the vocabulary, the writing, and the reading skills in order for them to complete that activity. I may be asking them all of the WH, the what, the when, the where, the who, and the how, and elevating those questions into critical thinking level questions. I may also ask the students to complete a sentence frame, but for these higher level students in the class, I may have to remove the sentence frames in order for them to write independently without any help. And also, graphic organizers, just like the Frayer model, may also be applied for higher level students. Maybe instead of asking them to draw a picture on the Frayer model, I may have to ask them to write words or answer questions. And I'm going to give you some of these variations on how to use a Frayer model in your classroom, depending on the level of your students. Now, we can also differentiate the process by which students acquire knowledge. So first of all, I can teach vocabulary, just like I said. Instead of having the students read right away, I can have all the vocabulary words listed out. I can have pictures side by side with vocabulary words so that they can see that, or maybe show a short video and then highlight vocabulary words in the video to introduce the article. And then sometimes for my lower level students, I would read to them and they could read silently with me. And then we'll read together. And also for my lower level students, the differentiating process occurs when I pause and chunk the text and stop and ask the students, okay, what have you learned from so far? What were the key ideas that you've gained? Are there any vocabulary words you did not recognize? Are you able to answer some of the WH questions that I wanted to ask at this point of the article? And then we can practice writing the vocabulary words, practice the writing, giving the definition in form of a dictation. And I can also start practicing with them how to complete a sentence frame in both written and spoken form. For my mid-level students, I could differentiate the instruction also by teaching vocabulary, but this time eliminating the definition so that they will have more recognition of the word in rote memory. We can also read the article together, but most of the time my mid-level students, based on my experience, are already able to read the article aloud. Sometimes I would assign one student in the group to read out loud and the rest read silently with that person. This time, during the chunking of the text, I would pause and ask questions, but instead of asking just one or two questions, I would increase the number of questions for my middle level students. Dictation would also increase the number of words, and also we will start using graphic organizers with my mid-level students, as I found, based on my experience, that Frayer Model is really a great practice. What we normally do with Frayer Models is we have students create the Frayer Models. They sometimes draw pictures or write words, and then we collect these Frayer Models and then show samples of Frayer Models across the walls of the classroom, so they can see these words and read these words every day, make that visual association with the word and its meaning. And lastly, for my higher level students, I would challenge them. But I would challenge them by thinking about a little bit more vocabulary, thinking about synonyms and antonyms. We can also read the article together, and then asking higher level questions as well, such as how did it happen? Provide me a list of steps, or provide me the chronology of events that leads up to a particular climax in the story or the article. My goal for my higher level students at this point is to ask critical thinking questions. Sentence frames are quite useful, especially if I'm asking more complex questions of these students, and then various graphic organizers incorporated within those sentence frames, such as like a Venn diagram. And I also want my students to be able to write independently in complete sentences when we practice marginal notes. You know, as they read, I ask the students to underline words they don't understand, or underline key ideas, or encircle words that are very complex to them, that they do not know the meaning of, so we can expound on that later on in the discussion. I just wanted to point out that the WH technique, there are a lot of resources in the IPDay website that will really help you understand that technique. We have if you go into the ADE channels, under videos, you can find the who, what, when, where, and also the what, why, how, building paragraphs with evidence. These are both grab and go videos, a quick 2 to 3 minute video talking about this technique and how you can use them in your classroom. It even comes complete with sample lesson plans and sample worksheets that you can easily or readily implement into your class. I just wanted to point out that the top grab and go that I'm showing you here, the who did what, when, where, is actually a lower level activity as compared to the what, why, how, just by looking at the types of question. The bottom grab and go, the what, why, how, building paragraphs with evidence, is really going to help you build your student skills towards GED. As we all know, GED writing and reading is all about finding evidence, and finding evidence that supports the author claim. Just like I said, I'm giving you an example of a Frayer model. This is a more complex type of Frayer model. Just like I said, this type of Frayer model is something that I would use with my higher level students, because it doesn't have pictures. It just has the definition of the word, maybe list down some facts that they know about the word or relate to the word, and then have them come up with synonyms and antonyms. By using this Frayer model with my higher level students, I'm able to expand their vocabulary. And also it helps them when they're revising their writing, as to they can pick the appropriate synonym word that would best replace a particular word in a sentence to make it sound more formal or to make it more precise and exact in terms of meaning. Antonyms is just to expand the student's understanding of a particular word, which is something that is also tested in ABE, such as the TABE test. Now, there are also resources from the IPDAY website if you want to learn more about the Frayer model. So if you go under the GED and pick the videos channel, you will be able to select one of those, which is entitled the Frayer model. And it will give you a 2 to 3 minute video talking about how to use the Frayer model in the classroom. What is it? How can you vary that? And in addition to that, again, there are worksheets, lesson plans that you can use readily and apply the Frayer model into your classroom if that's something that's most interesting to you. Let me take a moment to talk about scaffolding a little bit. Scaffolding is really when we move students from complete dependence to complete independence. Whatever we do in the classroom to allow that student to be able to become more responsible for their own learning and become more independent as you vary various activities and provide different expectation in terms of products. So it could be at the early stages of teaching that you are demonstrating a lot and you're explaining a lot and you're showing pictures a lot and you're providing feedback a lot. And as you move forward, you now release some of that responsibility to other students in the class, may it be higher level students or students that are more interested or more inclined to a particular topic. So from that shared practice, we can gradually move them towards guided practice. It's a semi-independent practice with your feedback. Guided practice is usually done independently at first, and then students exchange work with each other, and then they provide each other some feedback. Or sometimes what we will do is if student volunteers to show their work, we would pick a piece of writing and show it under the ELMO, and then students can read it and provide some constructive feedback on how to further improve the student's writing. And lastly, there has to be some independent practice. Your students must have time where they can practice their skill independently, because the bottom line is when they take that standardized test, you will not be there. You or their classmates or their group mates will not be there when they take that test. So they have to be able to do things independently in the classroom. Scaffolding is also important to know that scaffolding is equally important to your struggling students as it is to your higher achieving students. This is another visual that I would like to show you that really emphasizes how the process of scaffolding is. So as you move through a particular lesson or you teach a particular skill, the amount of responsibility on the part of the teacher has to decrease over time, and then it's inversely proportional to the student responsibility. So as time goes by, more and more student activities or independence are being applied to the student. You may recognize it by this phrase, I do it first, then we do it together, then you all do it, and then you do it alone. I just wanted to point out where I'm taking out all of these differentiation techniques. Where I got them from is actually from the English Language Proficiency Standards for Adult Education, this report that came late last year. One of the most fascinating things about this is that it has that scaffolding and recommendations page. You can find that if you have a copy of an electronic copy or a hard copy of the English Language Proficiency Standard. You can find the scaffolding recommendations at the last page of the book. And I'm going to go over each of these components as we move forward with this webinar. So teacher and language exchanges is the top portion or the top section of the scaffolding and supports page. As you can see, it groups the students by levels of ESL levels. Please keep in mind that the ELP levels doesn't necessarily pertain to the actual ESL level of your students. That's something that we will cover as we move forward, or we have covered that already in some of our English language proficiency standard workshops. But more importantly, what I want you to take a look at is how some of the scaffolding differentiation techniques are being distributed across the levels of ESOL. So under the levels 1 and 2, or your beginning levels of ESOL, you have to give more weight time, contextualize the language a little bit more, and you're going to find yourself having to repeat, paraphrase, model most of the time. As you move to levels 3 and 4, you are still providing them wait time because you're now asking more complex questions. You are still providing contextualization because that's something that is a best practice in ESOL and just promotes that level of engagement. And then you may be finding yourself also repeating yourself, paraphrasing or modeling, but not as often as if you're teaching levels 1 and 2. And then when you go into ELP level 5, you're now just simply modeling complex grammatical structures. So let's talk about these teacher and student exchanges that we see in the classroom or we are already applying as ESOL teachers. One of the techniques and strategies I wanted to spend a little bit more time on is the wait time. Studies show that if you give 3 or more seconds of undisturbed wait time to your students, that it will give you or provide you with the possible outcomes of their answers are a little bit more lengthier and they're more correct. The level of I don't know or the number of I don't know responses from your students decreases. And then if you do wait just a few more seconds, you would find out and you'll have more student volunteers and you can call on more choices. And you're going to find yourself not calling on the same student over and over. Another technique that I wanted you to focus on is the repeat, model, paraphrase, and gesture. Repeating, modeling, and paraphrasing is just a best practice, especially at the lower levels of ESOL. Repetition is something that would help build their vocabulary. Modeling, especially when you're talking about basic sentence structures or grammar rules that you're trying to teach them, such as subject-verb agreement, or tenses. I always find myself paraphrasing for my students because not everybody, just like what you said, not everybody have the same cultural or educational background. So if a student doesn't understand what I just said, I will repeat it exactly the first time, but the second time I would repeat it, I would slightly paraphrase it in a way that student might be able to understand. And then, of course, all of the teachers in ESOL, you find yourself gesturing a lot. We're like speaking mimes in our classroom because we find that if we do that, there's just an increased level of understanding. One word of advice is that as the students move up the levels, we need to decrease the number of gestures that we do in class because of the fact that when they take this standardized testing, there won't be anyone that's going to be gesturing to them. Think aloud. This is something that I do a lot, and I'm doing that right now when I'm doing a webinar. Every time I think aloud, I just say it out loud. I just wanted to model my students my thinking. Okay, so these are some of the recommendations how you should implement think aloud. So first, the teacher models and while thinking aloud, and the students are listening. Sometimes the teacher would just simply think aloud, and the students check the teacher's work or provide assistance. Sometimes the student would think aloud on their own as a large group, and I will monitor the students and assist them and provide some feedback to correct their processing of information. Sometimes I would have students think aloud in smaller groups because students find, if you're an experienced ESOL teachers, you'd find out it's very easy for students to talk when they're in smaller groups than talking into a big whole class setting. Sometimes I would have individual students think aloud in a forum or a fishbowl, and then the teacher would simply monitor the conversation and provide feedback that way. Teachers or students should think aloud orally in writing. We can do it a lot under the ELMO. When a student, I would probably ask a student to come to the front of the class and explain their work under the ELMO. Sometimes I think aloud doesn't have to be loud or spoken. Sometimes it's written. So if a student has a difficulty explaining to me what's going on or providing some feedback, I would give the student a piece of sticky note for them to provide or write or draw what they think. And then journaling is another technique that ESOL teachers use a lot. This just provides us an insight on the thinking process of the students that we can check later on and provide feedback. Other techniques are that are mentioned in the teacher and student exchanges are giving step-by-step directions. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about native language. A lot of what I've encountered in the field is like teachers ask me, so you're allowing your students to speak Spanish or Haitian in class? Yes, it is appropriate at the lower levels because they need that native language in order to be able to connect to English. When students process information, they receive the information in English, process it in their native language, think about the word in their native language, translate it back into English, and then spit it back out to the teacher or to the classmate asking the question. Concentrate on the meaning rather than correctness. A lot of teachers at the lower levels, we need to think more about how correct we need to think more about what the student meant and not really correcting every single grammatical error that we encounter in the student's spoken or written language. We wanted to concentrate more on meaning so that we know if they're able to process that information. Also, have the students demonstrate their understanding by pointing or gesturing. So if they're not able to completely explain what they meant, you can have pictures or choices in the classroom where they can go to. Sometimes I would divide the class into two, a pro and a con, and then as they agree or disagree in certain topics that I show or pictures that I show, students move to that side of the room that corresponds to their choice. And then also model processes and the language. Just modeling proofreading, modeling the writing process, that initial draft, that second draft, and then the third draft, and then coming up with your final and more efficient, more smooth, more coherent paragraph is really a good process to practice in class. It helps them not only in the writing portion of the GED test, but it also helps them if they're now going to write for their own cover letter or composing their resume or actually applying for a college and answering that written prompt. So let's move on to materials and activities. Materials and activities also can be scaffolded and differentiated according to levels of the students. So we're going to talk about some of the techniques that I like so much under this section of the scaffolding and supports page of the English Language Proficiency Standards. So as you can see, some of the examples that I see is I build background knowledge with the students. I use visuals a lot, not to a point that my classroom looks like an elementary classroom, but for my classroom to look like it's full of learning. When they come into the classroom, they see all of these visuals. They get a visual overload, but they also develop that photographic memory in being able to connect vocabulary words to certain feelings or to certain roles in the classroom or certain procedures that I want them to do. And then they get used to those routines, which really help me in managing the classroom as well. Sometimes it's also good to use materials and visual to check how your students feel, to show that you're sensitive to what's going on, because there's more to their life than school. So sometimes I would have in my lower level classes, I would provide them with a sheet and I would want them to point into the section as to that best describe how they feel. So are they excited today? Do they feel embarrassed after speaking in front of the class? Or are they afraid of something or something that happened outside of school and that's really impacting their learning? By gauging how the students feel, I'm able to kind of tailor my instruction to be more sensitive to those students' needs. I love graphic organizers. I take a lot of graphic organizers that I see on Pinterest and I laminate them because I want to reuse them, but I do not want to make so many copies of them. It allows my students to frame their thinking and to organize their ideas into and then create a better writing at the end. So in training students on how to get the main idea, which is something that is really the main focus of the new TABE test. Main idea and details is something that students have a very difficulty in grasping. So at beginning levels, we may have to use this graphic organizer after the reading and have students just jot down some of the details and help them formulate that main idea into a more coherent sentence. And then this is something that's really cute I wanted to show you is this Oreo technique. Oreo stands for O, opinion, R for reason, E for example, R for reason, and then the next E is for another example, and then O is the opinion restated. So we will have, let's say, we'll start off with, okay, well, what's the author's opinion? Or we'll start off with, what is your opinion? And then I'll have the students provide some reasoning based on what they read, list them down, and then provide examples of that reasoning, and then provide more reasoning, because as we find out in the GED test, in the GED writing, and or even CASAS test, students must be able to find those evidences. And then I ask at the end, after the Oreo method, to restate their opinion based on how we framed all those ideas together. It's just a good teaching technique. Another thing that I wanted to show you are graphic organizers that promote critical thinking, such as a two-zone Venn diagram. Two-zone Venn diagram is best used when you're trying to compare and contrast two different things or two different ideas or opposing views in an article. Another graphic organizer that I use a lot in my ESOL class is the process graphic organizer or the cycle graphic organizer. A lot of the things that we do, just like the writing process, the problem-solving technique, or even leadership, happens in the form of a cycle, and they go through various stages. Sometimes we will read a story and then have the students tell me what happened first, what happened second, what happened third, what about after that? And then at the end of the story, I will ask the student, how does the story come full circle to you? And it provides me a different insight on how students interpreted various reading articles and how they incorporated their own personal experiences and their cultural backgrounds and how they use that to relate to the article that they're reading. A lot of you may be noticing about that section that says TPR. TPR stands for total physical response. And the best way I could think of to show to explain this to you is to show this technique in action. So sit back and relax and watch this quick 2 to 3 minute video talking about and illustrating the total physical response technique.
Total physical response, or TPR, is a technique that uses body movement to help students understand and remember new vocabulary. It is thought to lower anxiety and facilitate learning by connecting language to a physical movement. In this activity, teacher Libby Costello uses TPR to introduce and reinforce action verbs. Libby incorporates this activity as a warm-up from the very first day of class.
Listen, repeat, and show me. Cook, 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 cook. Eat, 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 eat. Drink, 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 drink.
Libby starts with 5 verbs. She says a verb, acts it out, and asks students to repeat. While new verbs are added in subsequent classes, Libby reuses all the verbs throughout the cycle so that students become very comfortable with them.
Run, 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 walk, walk.
As the cycle progresses, Libby incorporates verbs that are specific to each life skill unit. She also expands the activity to include work on verb forms, pronouns, and possessive adjectives.
Wash the window. Wash the window.
Here, Libby has students practice using the present continuous.
I want you to listen, repeat, and show me. Cook. 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 What are you doing?
I am cooking.
Eat.
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 What are you doing?
I am eating.
With a slight variation, students practice using personal pronouns.
Cook.
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 What are you doing?
I am cooking.
What is she doing?
She is cooking.
What is he doing?
He is cooking.
What are they doing?
They are cooking.
Eat.
Eat. Eat.
What are you doing?
I am eating.
What is Lisa doing?
She is eating.
What is Duncan doing?
She is eating.
What are Rebecca and Becca doing?
They are eating.
It is very common to use TPR with commands. By using the imperative form of the verb and adding questions, Libby provides practice with possessives.
Listen, repeat, and show me. Write your name.
Write your name.
Write your name.
Write your name.
What are you doing?
I am writing my name.
Good, I am writing my name. Very good. What is Freddie doing?
He is writing.
He is writing his name. What is Daisy doing?
She is writing.
What are Roberto and Mercedes doing?
They are writing.
All right, so I'm going to pause the video from that point on. I hope you liked that video. The teacher not only applied the process, the technique of total physical response, but the teacher implemented other best practices in teaching ESOL. And the teacher did not just simply rely on that low-level scaffolding technique, but the teacher continuously increased the level of complexity of the action, incorporating various tenses of verbs, various language structures, and parts of speech. So towards the end, I'm going to talk about the materials and activities. A lot of my students, they bring their own books, but I also provide them with bilingual glossaries in the classroom just in case they forget their books. I want them to be able to access those books. I have enough copies for as many students as needed. I also create visuals, word phrase cards. What we normally do is we'll take these word phrase cards, they will create some word phrase cards on their own, and then we'll put it and use a single binder, like that ring binder, and the students can take it with them and use it to communicate to other people as they develop their English language. Sentence frames and sentence starters. I just want to give you some examples of what those are. I find these two examples really interesting. I found them on the internet, and I thought I would just share them with you. That sentence starters and sentence frames, the one on to your left combines a graphic organizer and a sentence frames together. And you can see as you analyze it, it's not just a simple activity. You can easily remove certain words here or the number of scaffolds in order to allow the student to independently complete the graphic organizer. And then another thing that I do is sometimes at the lower levels, I would place English words that we know, English phrases or starters that we usually use in class to communicate during whole class discussion or small group discussion, and place them side by side with their Spanish, Haitian, Chinese word equivalents. So I know it takes a lot of time to prepare those, but you can find a lot of these already available from the internet. So just look them up, Google them up, go to Pinterest, go to an ESL website that you like. I'm sure they have one or more variations of these types of sentence starters. I found also this Word Nerds activity, which provides various activities that students can do in class, and also a vocabulary log. If you don't know what a vocabulary log is, it's kind of like a glossary, but a little bit more incorporating a Frayer type model, which applies a lot of the lower level students in my class, they like it the most. I would run so many copies of this, and then I would punch holes and they would put them in a binder. And every now and then I would quiz them or review these words with them as we practice and look at various different articles. So I hope you like these activities that I kind of outlined for you. As you may know, you can always look back at these things when you review this webinar at a later time, or also look at the handout section provided together with this webinar. So lastly, I want to just talk about groupings. Groupings are best applied appropriately with students. So I'm not suggesting every time students have to be working in groups. Just like I said, based on the scaffolding, the scaffolding technique, students must have almost an equal amount of opportunity to work with a partner or in groups as they are working independently. So you must use grouping sparingly. That's what you're going to see as suggested by the English Language Proficiency Standards. So at this point in time, I think I've kind of overloaded you with a lot of information, a lot of which you may already be doing in your class, and I'm just letting you know and verifying that, hey, what you're doing in class is actually best practice, and you're not the only one doing it. Everybody else is doing it. So I want to take in some questions, so feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A tab, and then I'm just going to go through and go through some of your questions and comments here for a minute. I wanted to just mention Miss Bard's comment. She said, according to her, I try to meet the needs of my students throughout the duration of the class. Some activities are targeted to lower students and some are higher, and which is so true. You know what I find out in some of the teachers they struggle more in differentiating instruction to the higher level students than they do for their lower level students. What's best to do is to try to practice and design activities that both will support your lower level students and at the same time challenge your higher level students. And as she continues, she talks about over the period of class, they try to make sure that something is accessible to everyone, which is building that culture in the classroom. Ms. Merson talked about we only have a few ESL students. However, there's a great difference in the schema and abilities of English-speaking students. And that's true. That just re-emphasizes the fact all the more we have to differentiate instruction so that we make the best learning experience for those students. Ms. Chalker talked about students come to us with differing academic experience. Very true. And then following up with Ms. Rosa Lynn Shell, she's talking about how great the graphic organizer and how beneficial are they for there. There's a question from Christina Mercado. They would like to know the website for Newsela. So when you go back to that page, you'll see the title is Newsela. That's newsela.org. So NEWZELA.org. So that's how you can do that. Or you can just type in into Google the word Newsela. Okay, and then there's another question here, and I'm going to answer this one last question. If I couldn't get to your question, just because of time, we'll address them as we move forward. Miss Montero is asking an overhead. What's the difference between an overhead and an ELMO? ELMO is not really an acronym. It's really is what we call, it's more of a vendor-created word. An ELMO is just like an overhead projector, but more like, it connects to a digital projector, and it allows you to project pages of your book, things that are opaque. So you don't have to put them on a transparency paper in order for you to project writing or